Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Film Haven Reviews. I'm your host Sawyer as always, and today we are finishing up our middle-aged Godzilla theme with the 1991 film Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And wow, what a crazy movie this was. Definitely going back a little bit, just a little bit towards the 70s and 60s Godzilla movies with just kind of losing all kind of sense of seriousness. I mean, sure, the characters act serious in the movie, but there's definitely a light-hearted, almost not, I wouldn't say low budget, but just kind of like, you could tell that movies like Terminator, or T2, I should say, Terminator 2, and Star Trek was really big during this time. You could tell that those influences are kind of bleeding into this film, and we'll discuss all the different ways in which those different influences manifest. But first impressions here, I'm probably going to give this movie a 7 out of 10, same as I gave the last movie with Godzilla vs. Biollante. The only difference, though, I would say, is that I maybe like this one just a little bit more. If I was still doing kind of more specific ratings, I would give it like a 7.3 or something. But since we're doing kind of in 0.5 increments, 7 out of 10 is fine, with just the caveat of saying that I like this a little bit more than Biollante. The reason being is because it wasn't like half measures. Biollante was kind of had 1 foot in the craziness and then 1 foot in the seriousness, and it didn't necessarily work all the whole time. But the fights between, I think Biollante was a very interesting and unique monster, and some of the fights were pretty like cool, and the setting was dark, and a really good design on Biollante, very unique. Now King Ghidorah, of course, is a returning character that was in a lot of the 60s and 70s movies, but interestingly enough, the one of the things that makes this movie a little different is this is the first time that Godzilla is actually fighting King Ghidorah 1v1. Usually he would kind of recruit some of the other monsters to help him fight King Ghidorah, but this time it's 1v1, so that's kind of cool. But yeah, so let me just read for you just to show, like, okay, so for example, I think we're getting into the point here with these movies that it kind of seems like they're figuring out the scenarios before they're figuring out the plot. Very similarly, actually, to the way that they've done Mission Impossibles in the last like 6 entries in the series, where they just do stunts. They're like, okay, what stunts can Tom Cruise do? So then they film the stunts, and then they make a story based off of the stunts, which that is true, by the way, which is kind of how this is going. Like King Ghidorah, for example, he was in this movie because there was a contest for what was fans wanting to see for the next monster, and they wanted King Ghidorah, so that was who was in the movie. So I have an interesting, like, kind of suspicion that maybe they didn't have a lot of the plot written, and then they just kind of wrote around the fact that, okay, Godzilla's fighting King Ghidorah, how can we make this work? And you can kind of get that sense it's not that this movie doesn't make as much sense as the last one. I feel like it actually does. It's just more out there and just more outlandish and more sci-fi, I will say, even though the last one was sci-fi. I mean, we got gene splicing, a human and Godzilla and a plant, so that was crazy. But in this one, let me just read for you the storyline as per IMDb, because it is quite the mouthful, and it'll give you kind of an idea, because this time we got UFOs, time travelers, aliens coming in, so you know that they're losing the grounded tone of our first film of this series, The Return of Godzilla. Anyway, from IMDb, it says, time travelers from the 23rd century return to 1992 to warn Japan that Godzilla will cause a catastrophic nuclear incident in the 21st century and suggest a way to rid the world of him forever. They intend to go back to 1944 to Ragos Island, where a dinosaur was exposed to radiation from the Bikini H-bomb test and became Godzilla. Upon completion of this task, King Ghidorah appears in 1992, and the visitors' true plan is discovered. They wish to destroy Japan so it will not become the dominant economic force. Luckily for the Japanese, Godzilla was still created and will now fight King Ghidorah. So that, if you're following that, good job. Even with the breakdown there, it's complicated. In basic terms, the movie has kind of like in Return of Godzilla, there's really like 3 main human characters that aren't like sci-fi characters. And there's a reporter who's working on breaking a story about Godzilla. There is the psychic girl from the last movie by Alante, although she doesn't really play that big of a role, and her psychic powers don't really come in at all, except for like one scene, which is a little weird. And then there's a scientist. Once again, it's a dinosaur expert. So a lot of this movie is kind of more focused on the past as well as the future, obviously, with the time travel. The past, because like I read, there was an incident on an island between American forces and Japanese forces during World War II, where basically the Americans were about to wipe out the Japanese. And so Godzilla, or a dinosaur, comes in and ends up killing all the Americans, which is interesting, and saving the Japanese soldiers' lives. And so from then on, like one of the characters in the movie is the kind of commander of that unit, and this is present day, 1992, present day. He still has a lot of reverence for Godzilla, like, because they basically, he saved their lives. And so while he's a monster, at the same time, he is a savior, even if it was inadvertent. And so basically what they come to realize through this journalist and then this dinosaur expert, they realize like that same dinosaur from this kind of rumored war story is the one that was exposed to radiation via the H-bomb tests on Bikini Island, which, if you remember Godzilla -1, or even I think the original Godzilla, I think that is generally how Godzilla has been seen as getting his powers. In Godzilla -1, you have a very similar setup here. They definitely took from this film for sure, although it's not a war story in the same, it's not the same specifics. It is very similar in a way. In Godzilla -1, right, it's this kamikaze pilot who decided to not kill himself and come back to the island. And when he was at this island, Godzilla, as like kind of a dinosaur form, attacks everybody there. Now this time Godzilla is attacking the Japanese soldiers, but in this movie he's saving the Japanese soldiers. But it's a similar vibe, because then there's a quick montage in Godzilla -1 as well of Godzilla kind of powering up from the H-bomb tests. So I think that was really interesting. I'm not sure if this is the introduction of that storyline or that like kind of archetype. Like I said, I'd have to watch the original again to see if they mentioned the bikini test, because I think that might be true. But anyway, so that's what they're focusing on a lot of, is going back in time to this whole sub story, which is fun. I think as far as the human story goes, it was kind of more interesting than the last one for sure, and maybe even the Return of Godzilla. But the only issue is there wasn't a lot of Godzilla. Now, there was one scene, of course, when they go back in time on the island, where you see dinosaur Godzilla kind of having a bit of a fight scene with the American soldiers, which is fine. It just wasn't like Godzilla, like it's not until halfway through the movie, at least, that you even see like a significant, maybe 60, almost 70% of the movie till you see a significant Godzilla scene. And that was kind of disappointing. However, I will say, while the first fight between Ghidorah and Godzilla is like kind of whatever, I wasn't like super into it. The last fight, they have a second fight later, and that one was actually pretty fun, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So like I said, there's a lot of focus on this past stuff because they have a UFO that comes down and in the present day, and they are basically these futuristic beings from the 23rd century who are convincing the Japanese government at the time to go back in time to basically get rid of Godzilla, because they say Godzilla is going to destroy Japan, and if they don't do that, then Japan can't prosper. But as it turns out, Japan does prosper. In the 23rd century, they're basically like the new Roman Empire, of the world, like modern day, where they have basically, through like land speculation and big land deals, they have kind of gobbled up all these like areas from Africa and South America. And next thing you know, like Japan, the Japanese empire of sorts, is taking over half the world. And so they're so powerful that pretty much no one has any ability to fight them. And so that's what these people from the future are trying to reverse. And so, of course, they have ulterior motives. One thing increasing the silliness of this film is that idea of them being from the future. All their future tech, this is a 1991 movie, and like a very Star Trek kind of vibe in that way, as far as the budget of what it looks like. Like they're obviously using like escalators inside of the spaceships, and I'm like, these are just escalators. they're using keyboards, and I'm like, okay, I mean, I get it. Like, right, Star Wars is kind of like this like retro futurism of sorts where you got this kind of grimy, you know, keyboards and things that are very almost low tech that are supposed to be high tech. I get that, but in this one, it's not necessarily going for that. It's trying to be futuristic, and it doesn't really sell on it. And it's also obviously these like kind of low quality sets as well, which is not great. Also, they have androids, and one of the main kind of side characters that they use a lot in the story is this android M11 or M2, and he's just silly. Like, this is obviously comes out in the same year as Terminator 2, and it definitely has that feeling of them trying to do like Temu Terminator, where when he's bad at one point, and when he's bad, he's like using his powers for bad, and then they reprogram him to be good, and then now he's like their secret weapon with as far as what the human stories go. And just him like running, there's like a scene where he's running and chasing after a Jeep, and it's just so silly, the effects that they use. I'll definitely put that up there so that you can see what I'm talking about, because it's just one of those things where you got to shake your head. But like I was saying with Biollante, right? Like, one of the things that I kind of liked about Biollante, as much as it was kind of like not nearly as good as Return of Godzilla as far as the serious tones, there was some of that Lucia Fulci, so bad it's good vibe going on as well. You can kind of laugh. It was entertaining. It was kind of funny how weird it was. So I think there was even more of that in this film, because it's just such a wacky premise that there's this like time travelers coming in. It's like, what does Godzilla have to do with time traveling? But considering that the next few movies in this Heisei era is like Godzilla versus Space Godzilla, Mecha Godzilla 2, there's one called Destroya. I mean, they're losing the seriousness, and they're going into the fun again, which is kind of like the 60s and 70s. Obviously, at some point, if you've done, I guess it makes sense, right? If you've done the story of Godzilla versus the humans already, you can't really do it again. It's kind of like, I mean, you can eventually, but not right afterwards. And so you've got to have them fight other monsters. And the more other monsters you make them fight, the less room you have to create like really grounded stories. And so, of course, you're going to be falling victim to these kind of sillier films. So in some ways, I guess I don't really blame them, but it does make me prefer Return of Godzilla over these two. But let's get into King Ghidorah, because the way that, speaking of silliness, the way that King Ghidorah is created is absolutely ridiculous. So like we talked about back in the day, in 1944, Godzilla is a dinosaur. Well, they go back in time, right? They use time travel to go back. And the main time travel agent, this girl who is like helping the three humans I talked about, the scientist, the reporter, the psychic girl, she's kind of facilitating this kind of mission to go back in time, but she's also got these little pets in her like time travel flight, plane, and they basically look like little dragon bat babies, and they're apparently all the rage in the 23rd century, because they're specifically engineered to be the best pets and human companions possible, and they're very easy to control. And I don't know how I didn't see this in the, coming, but what happens is that when they're back in time, she secretly lets those little weird bat things, they're called like Dorats or something. She lets, I'll put that up too. If you see their faces, it's just obviously these puppets, and it just looks so ridiculous. But she lets them out, and basically instead of Godzilla getting zapped by the H-bomb and turning into some monster, these three little dragon babies get turned into King Ghidorah, the three-headed dragon monster that's supposed to shoot fire on the posters, but actually shoots lightning beams, which I'm like, lightning beams would look cool in a poster too. I don't know why there was a kind of disconnect there. A little disappointed by that, but anyway. So the first fight between King Ghidorah and Godzilla, because of course Godzilla still exists. I don't know. They didn't really explain that super well, even though they teleported Godzilla away basically so that he wouldn't get hit by the H-bomb, so he wouldn't exist in the 21st century. He still does somehow, and he comes back to save the world, the world from Godzilla. I mean, not from Godzilla, from King Ghidorah. But anyway, that first fight, they're kind of out in a field, and it's just a lot of like the kind of suit and puppet tree of King Ghidorah is just not really well done to me. There's literally scenes where you can see the cables coming from the costume, which is not great to me. I mean, I do love a good practical suit, of course, but it's just a lot of it was just like shooting a heat ray and the other one shooting their lightning rays, and I don't know, because they're in a field, it just didn't. I like them when they're in a city, I guess, because it gives you more depth to the fighting, and there's more destruction happening. So it's just a little bit more weight to the punches and things. And this one, it just kind of seemed like you were just very aware that it was on a set. It was going back once again to like playing beach volleyball in a water tank with a giant lobster. So I kind of had that feeling. And there's even one scene where Godzilla like grabs it by the tail, King Ghidorah by the tail, and starts slamming it down on the ground, and it just looks stupid. I'm not gonna lie. So I was like really not enjoying this movie at that point, because I was like, man, I waited this long for the Godzilla fight scene and it's not even that good. Like I was getting a little frustrated. But he defeats King Ghidorah and famously bites off one of his heads, which is really interesting because, of course, in the 2017 movie, Godzilla King of Monsters in the American series, when he fights King Ghidorah, I believe he bites off King Ghidorah's head. On this one, he heat rays it off, but still, you get the vibe. I liked the kind of Easter egg there in the new movie. That's kind of fun. But King Ghidorah comes back later and they've fixed him up and he's got this mechanical middle head. Now it's like kind of Mecha King Ghidorah, and there's with like metal wings and like upgraded basically, and the middle head shoots like a special lightning laser thing, and they're actually in Tokyo fighting, and so it definitely ups the ante, and it's a long drawn out fight scene, lots of really good. I mean, it still basically comes down to them just shooting beams at each other, but at least when they're shooting beams, sometimes they're missing and hitting the buildings and it's destroyed, and there's like just more practical explosions and just it's just more of a feast for the eyes, like Godzilla's supposed to be, instead of this like weird kind of toned down fight in the middle of nowhere. So I did like that. And then there's also a bit, I don't know when, I had to do some research. I don't know when Power Rangers became a thing, but there is a bit of like Power Rangers coming into this now, because the main kind of time travel agent who's now fighting with the modern day people against the future people, because she's changed her ways, of course. She's got to be like the turncoat for good. She's now fighting within Ghidorah's like metal breastplate as like basically a Power Ranger. If you remember those, when they do their little morphin thing and they become the big mech suit. She's basically doing that, controlling the middle head, and then they end up basically at the end of the fight, Godzilla definitely wins, but as a last ditch effort, this plan they had the whole time, they eject this like kind of capture machine from the breastplate. They shoot out these tendrils that electrify, and like they're like kind of like shackles, like prisoner shackles. They shoot out at him and then basically use it as a towing winch so that Ghidorah can fly off and drop him into the ocean. And I'm like, why didn't you just do that to begin with? Like this whole fight. But once again, they had to have the fight. I'm thinking too much about the logic. But anyway, as you could tell, what's most important in this movie ultimately is the monster fighting, and there is some good ones. There's a good climactic monster fight at the end. Very much highly recommend just to watch this movie just for that. And especially if you're doing a completionist, this is definitely a fun one to get into. The time travel stuff is at least vaguely interesting at the beginning. I was definitely, when I saw the UFO in like the first 5 minutes, I was like, oh, okay, we're in for a ride here for sure. And it didn't necessarily disappoint. It just went on a little bit too long. The movie's like an hour and 51 minutes. Definitely doesn't need to be that long, of course. And it just took too long for Godzilla to come in, and I didn't like that either. So while there is some fun stuff, I think that the time travel things is silly. The android was ridiculous. There's some like space marine android fighting in it as well, which is, if you're into that stuff, it's kind of fun. But it also is distracting a little bit, because I'm like I love action, but this action's kind of hokey, and I would rather see, instead of laser shooting, that bad effect laser shooting, by the way, from the android fighting on these futuristic soldiers. Instead of that, I'd rather just see more Godzilla, right? So it's just taking away from the core of what the movie's supposed to be. So I still think, though, they really did a good job with that last fight. And I think it was an interesting idea to go back to 1944. And obviously it was a good idea because they're reusing it in Godzilla -1. And that movie is lauded as one of the best Godzilla movies to date. So if it wasn't for this movie, this movie walked so Godzilla -1 could run. So there's some precedence there that I got to appreciate for. The suit, once again, for Godzilla, I think it's the same suit as the one from Biollante. And it's just so much better than what they had in Return of Godzilla. I had to give him props for that too. The suit is more mobile. He's using it. He's like moving around a lot more, but it doesn't look dumb. The only time it looks dumb is when they're out in the middle of the field, of course. One interesting thing about this movie too is that it actually was really controversial at the time. Of course, 1991 would be at like the height of this, like during the 80s, of course, Japan's economy is booming, and we had all these car manufacturers like Honda and Toyota, and everyone kind of like becoming like a Nissan, kind of invading America. And you also had Sony and all kinds of other electronic equipment companies kind of invading America, and it seemed like Japan was doing way better than America was in terms of capitalism. And there was a lot of tension economically between America and Japan because of that. 1991 was, of course, like kind of the peak of that, because it had been going on for so long that America was getting really tired of it. And then this movie, of course, has Americans basically being the bad guys. I didn't say this, but in the time travelers who are coming back from the future are all, Western looking at the very least. They're speaking Japanese, but they look like Americans, to be honest. And then, of course, when you go back in time, there's this entire scene where U.S. soldiers are being killed by Japanese soldiers, and then you got U.S. soldiers being killed by Godzilla, and it definitely didn't look great. At the time, especially within that time, because we had so much tension. I mean, to me, it's not too different than us using the Russians as the bad guys for the entire 80s and beyond. So it's like, I mean, it's not too different from what we were doing. It's one of those things where we get to do it, but then when other people do it, it's like, oh, it's controversial. But I think the original director, for example, thought it was too far. He thought that the director of this movie went too far, but the director of this movie was like, no, it wasn't really meant to be like that. It's just how it was, and it makes sense. I think that it's a cool story regardless. I don't think that it really mattered. I mean, World War II, Americans were fighting Japanese. That's just the way it was. So I don't think, and it's a Japanese movie, so of course the Japanese soldiers are going to be the protagonists. It just doesn't bother me too much. But it is interesting to think that at the time it was very controversial. And also another thing, one of the buildings that they destroy in the big fight scene at the end is apparently a replica of a very new building at the time that was apparently where all the tax records were kept and stored, and where basically it was like the tax building. And there's a rumor that a lot of people in Japan, whenever that building was destroyed by Godzilla, they were all cheering in the theater, which is really funny. I think that's hilarious. And it's a good lighthearted little trivia there. But anyway, I think that's everything I got to talk about this week. I really enjoyed this theme. It's always fun to do Godzilla. It's nice to kind of turn your brain off. But oddly, you got to activate it just a little bit, because there is so much trivia and practical effects and things to kind of get into. And it is really funny, just like with all these kind of subgenres of movies, as we got into spaghetti westerns a couple, months ago, and I could tell that within that genre, there's so many different kind of criterias to look into and compare. You can't really compare Godzilla with other types of movies because it's its own genre, basically. It's a creature feature, of course, but it's also a disaster film, but it's also, there's been so many entries of Godzilla's that you basically have to only compare Godzilla to other Godzilla films, which I think is really fun. And therefore you have this kind of hierarchy that's grown, and this comparison where you're like, well, this is the first time Godzilla's ever fought Ghidorah one-on-one. In the 60s and 70s, he was always getting help. And so now, it's not so much that the movie is as good as some other, movie at the time or something that was like, other than, I guess, economically, you could say ticket prices or ticket sales and everything like that. But whenever you're looking at these movies nowadays, it's just like, it's just one of the 40 different Godzilla movies. So you're comparing those to the other. So I love kind of getting into that subgenre and kind of stacking them up myself. I think that's kind of fun. So I'm sure we'll get into, I've already been looking into some other ones. Maybe next year I'll do another one. It seems like these high sci movies only get crazier. So after this one, like I said, there's like Godzilla. It would be kind of fun to get into some that are just absolutely ridiculous. The Godzilla versus Destroya, which I think is 1995. That one actually almost has a 7.0 on IMDb. This one, by the way, has 6.5, just like Biollante. And so that one might actually be better. So I think we might just keep going. There's one in 93, there's one in 95, and I think there's one in 97. So that's a whole nother theme right there. Next theme we're doing, I don't know yet, but I've got like 4 different ones that I could do. So I will decide by the time the next episode comes out. I hope you guys have a great week this week, and I will see you next Friday.